Welcome. I'm Katie Ross, the Director of Program at EYEJ, Empowering Youth Exploring Justice, and I specifically oversee YODJ, Youth Online Discussing Justice. I'm excited to share space with you all today to talk about trauma-informed social emotional learning in remote space. For some background, EYEJ, we drive social justice reform by empowering young people to advocate for change. And we do this through our YODJ, Youth Online Discussing Justice, and our Youth Council. Our YODJ program is the first step to empowering our youth to create change. With our 900 diverse volunteers, allies, corporations, sponsors, and community members, we drive social justice reform by engaging in civil discourse and dialogue related to social justice. What we do with our youth is three things. First, we're creating advocates for positive change. Our youth are working on driving social justice reform in their life and in their community by building on their skills to be self-valued leaders. Secondary, we work on leadership. Our students are learning how to work with others, no matter their race, ethnicity, social economic status. So together we can drive social justice reform. And finally, we focus on empowerment. How can we create self-valued leaders that utilize their desires and their personal interests to drive social justice reform? I'm excited to share space as we talk further about trauma-informed social emotional learning. Before we get into it, I want to make sure that everyone is aware that we want to think about adversity and trauma, and it can be difficult. No matter where you are, what you're doing in this moment, what space you're in, or who you are with, make sure that if you need to pause this presentation, or if you need to take a second, breathe, come back to it, we encourage you to do so. So what exactly is trauma-informed social emotional learning? I love this image on the right because it really shows that being trauma sensitive and engaging in social emotional learning are very much intertwined, and that we shouldn't have one without the other and vice versa. And so trauma-informed social emotional learning is really an approach. It's a lens in which we utilize to seek and create a safe and reliable environment where students who have experienced adversities and trauma feel supported. It's a space in which we explore our students' strengths. It's a space in which we work with our youth to exercise their agency, develop meaningful, positive relationships, and most importantly, it's a space in which we acknowledge and validate mental health issues and work together with our youth to find solutions to issues. So further into what exactly are ACEs and complex trauma. Adverse childhood experiences is a list of about 10 experiences that could be potentially traumatic for youth. It's primarily for youth 17 and younger. And these can include everything from homelessness to being in a family of divorced parents, to facing violence in their community, and so on. And adverse childhood experiences, there's been several research studies that show students that have several adversities, more than one, are at a predisposition and disadvantage in having negative outcomes in their future. When I say negative outcomes, I mean we're seeing students with several ACEs having higher risks of depression, higher risk of suicide attempts, as well as addiction, alcoholism, and so on. And so that's why it's incredibly important as educators and people who are surrounded and impacting our youth that we are taking more of a preventative standpoint, not an intervention standpoint. And so this specific discussion today are going to give you tools to be more preventative when it comes to being trauma informed. When a youth faces several adverse childhood experiences, this leads to complex trauma. And complex trauma here as it says on the slide, is defined as chronic, prolonged, and involves multiple traumatic experiences. The key thing here is that complex trauma can impair development, physically and mental health in complex ways, and has long-term impacts on the entire life. And complex trauma leads to toxic stress. Toxic stress is from that repeated exposure to adverse childhood experiences. And the key about toxic stress that's different than tolerable stress or positive stress is that toxic stress is happening all the time, every single day, and our youth don't have what they can to support themselves. So for example, I have a student in YODJ who recently had a cousin die by gun violence in his community. Thankfully, this student has a great support system, a father, a mother, a brother, and some other folks that he can rely on to get through this stress. Is it still stress? Absolutely. However, if he has the support system he needs, it can help mitigate the effects of it becoming toxic. However, a student who might be facing the same adversity, so gun violence in their community, may not have that support system, and that can easily create toxic stress. So adversities and prevalence. There's been a lot of research about, like I said, adverse childhood experiences. I'm going to focus a little bit more on violence. In the ACEs study, they do ask about violence, but violence is so broad, and our youth face violence in several different ways. And so it's important for us to kind of understand how violence can have an impact on our youth. In 2018, a national study found that students from 2 to 17 years old, that at least 8% of students knew one friend or family member in the past year who have been shot with a firearm. Additionally, the CDC stated that in 2014, homicide was the third leading cause of death among youth aged 10 to 24. And that violence was a major cause of non-fatal injuries. So again, we're seeing some secondary effects of violence. And in 2019, the EYEJ team did an evaluation with Kent State University, and EYEJ discovered that 50% of violence that youth experienced is witnessed via the television or secondhand. And most importantly, it has been found that in the United States, up to 90% of children will experience at least one traumatic event, which will lead to toxic stress or can lead to toxic stress. And therefore, in 2020, the EYEJ Impact 25 Youth Council identified toxic stress as an epidemic for youth in Cleveland. And on top of all the violence and secondary violence that students are facing, we are also in a pandemic. COVID-19 is very real. Students are feeling isolated, there's instability, and for those who are already facing adversities, this is deepening their complex trauma. They're missing out on social experiences and rite of passages, and schools for some students were their safe space. So they've lost their safe space. And finally, the digital divide, which is basically the idea that some students do not have equal access to broadband internet and devices, making the achievement gap even larger. And finally, above everything that we just talked about, students may be facing poverty, homelessness, hunger, toxic stress, incarceration, unsafe neighborhoods, and so on. And while I highlight violence and some adversities youth are facing, I want to look at it from a system perspective. When you think of systemic adversities, we want to highlight historical trauma, racial trauma, systemic oppression, and policy and practice. In regards to historical trauma, this really refers to the emotional and psychological wounding of a group. So for example, a student's grandparent might be a Holocaust survivor. The student themselves was never in the Holocaust per se, but there's generational and historical trauma from the family experiencing and being in the Holocaust. Similar to that, another student might have a grandparent that was at one point enslaved. And in a very similar manner, that student is not necessarily enslaved. However, that generational trauma, the trauma due to historical oppression of groups, can impact our youth. In regards to racial trauma, this refers to events that occur due to experiencing racism, discrimination, or structural prejudice. And so in this day and age where we have had an awakening to how much racial trauma is existing and happening to our youth, we have to make sure that we are validating and being very aware of what's happening in the United States. Next, systemic oppression. So this refers to ways in which any given form of oppression, so race, gender, class, language, may be holding people or groups back. And so this is when we have to think about our own identity as educators, social workers, anyone in the working profession with youth, that our identity, I'm a white female, is different than others' identities, and how that can shape oppression. So for example, myself, I'm a white woman, and I've definitely faced oppression for being female. However, in YODJ, primarily our youth are Black and African Americans, and we've had youth speak about their experiences and their identity of being a Black male in the United States, and how that has impacted their life experiences. And that really connects systemic oppression as well as racial trauma. And finally, we want to think about policy and practice. So this refers to the structure and foundation of systems such as governments or corporations that have created a variety of adversities for our youth. For example, the societal pressure to continue in one direction, or the pathway to success is college, a four-year university. This also has to do with social media demand. We've seen an increase in youth in depression and mental health issues, really surrounded to social media problems. And finally, fake news. And so youth are facing these systemic adversities as well as the adversities we spoke about earlier. And so what exactly happens in the brain when a child is experiencing a threat? So trauma during early childhood has just disruptive effects on the brain, and it can impact areas such as regulating your fear response, your impulse control, reasoning, planning, and academic learning. And so as you see here, this is a great visual on the right. It kind of gives a simplistic understanding of what happens. So first, we scan for real or perceived threats. And in this image to the right, that's per se a tiger. And so if your body perceived a threat, so they see the tiger, they immediately, what happens is your amygdala alters your hypothalamus and tells it to release a stress hormone. So you have to remember, I love using this analogy of the brain. Your brain develops from the brainstem and finally up all the way to the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed for males and females between age 24 and upwards of 28. And so for students 18 and under, their brainstem is developing and their brain is still in the process of developing. So when they see a perceived threat, this is notified at the brainstem, right where the brain is first created and developed. And so this gets passed on to the limbic system, as you can see in the image. And that's where the amygdala tells the hypothalamus to release a stress hormone. And this is all part of your sympathetic nervous system, which is located right around here in your brain. And so the body goes into fight, flight, or freeze. One way to think of it is the flip of the switch. So your brain is now in what do I do? And so when we flip of the switch, our youth, our student is no longer using the frontal part of their brain, the part that helps with processing, thinking, going through and deciding, is this a perceived threat or not? Am I safe or not? Am I okay? The body is just in the flip or switch. I need to protect myself. The hormones released into the body, and it's difficult to bring back the flip of the switch. And so for youth who are in adverse environments and are constantly having their brain flipped and are constantly releasing a stress hormone in their body, that is what's really having an impact on their fear response, impulse control, reasoning, planning, and academic learning. And so what we have to do as educators is help our students get from the flip of the switch back down to a calm state in a safe environment to be able to function. So we're going to spend the next 5 minutes reflecting and journaling. The question I want you all to think about is, in regards to adverse childhood experiences, what specific experiences may a student be facing and how have they been resilient?